February 5, 1944, on the Anzio beachhead in Italy. A 550-pound shell came down out of a clear sky, punched through 3 floors of a stone building and stopped in the cellar. Nobody had heard a gunfire. Somewhere beyond the hills sat a German railway gun the American troops would soon call Anzio Annie, and it could throw that shell almost 40 miles. The best heavy gun the Americans had on that beach was the 155mm Long Tom, and it reached 14. For 4 months, the Long Tom crews went hunting for the thing that fired that shell. They never silenced it. What finally took the gun away from them had nothing to do with a Long Tom at all. On paper, 2 heavy guns faced each other. The paper lied. The Long Tom was the finest heavy field gun the Allies owned. Its barrel was long and cleanly rifled, and it fired a 95-pound shell. The gun could put that shell 14 miles downrange onto a map reference the crew had never seen. American gunners at Anzio were fast and well drilled, and they never ran short of shells. When they had a target they could reach, they were as good as any gun crew in the war. That is the honest measure of the men doing the hunting. Skill was never their problem. Arithmetic was. The thing they were hunting was a Krupp railway gun, 28 centimeter across the bore, close to 11 inches. It rode on its own train, weighed better than 200 tons, and threw a 550-pound shell out to nearly 40 miles with the standard charge. The Germans had 2 of them in the hills south of Rome, dug in on the Ciampino rail line about 19 miles back from the beach. They named the guns Robert and Leopold. The men on the beach could not see either one, so they decided there was a single gun and gave it a single name. One number decided everything, and it never changed for 4 months. The guns sat 19 miles from the beachhead. The Long Tom reached 14. That is a gap of about 4 miles of empty air. The American shells could not cross. The gunners could compute a perfect firing solution and still watch their rounds fall short into open country. A gun they could not reach was a gun they could not hunt. For 4 months, that gap never closed by a single yard. The shells kept coming, and nothing on the beach could answer them. The first rounds landed on the 5th of February, 13 days after the landing. The gun called Robert fired first and put 15 shells onto the beachhead. After that, it became a routine. The men learned to hate. A shriek building overhead, a pause, then a 550-pound impact that no foxhole could stop. A Stars and Stripes correspondent wrote that the shells split through 3 floors of thick stone buildings and uprooted men from their holes in the ground. General Mark Clark, who commanded the whole beachhead, later said the sound of those shells passing overhead cost him many nights of sleep. When the shriek came, the cry went down the line. Here comes Annie. Worst of all was the randomness. A railway gun firing on a map square does not aim at a man. The shell simply arrives, and where it lands is a matter of chance. No one on the beach felt safe, at any hour, anywhere. A supply dump and a headquarters tent carried the same odds as a stretch of open sand. That is a great deal of fear to hang on one gun the enemy could not find. The ground made it worse. The Anzio landing had gone in on the 22nd of January, and within a week it had stalled into a shallow beachhead only a few miles deep, backed against the sea. The Germans held the high ground of the Alban Hills and looked straight down onto every road and gun pit the Allies owned. There was no deep rear area to hide in, and nowhere far enough back to be out of range. On a wide front, the men could have spread out and thinned their odds. Penned onto a few flat miles under German eyes, they had nowhere to go, and Annie's shells fell into a crowd. The hunt for Anzio Annie ran 4 months, led by the best counter-battery gunners in Italy. They threw every method they had at it, and the gun's range and its hiding beat all of them. The Americans understood the range problem, so they tried to close it. They brought up bigger guns, 200mm pieces with supercharged ammunition that could, in theory, throw a shell far enough to reach the German position. The theory was sound. Reaching the ground Annie stood on was one job. Hitting Annie was a different one, and it needed something the Americans never had. They did not know exactly where the gun was. It moved between shots and hid in the rock. When they guessed a position and let loose, the results tell you how hopeless the guessing was. One American battery fired 3,240 shells in a single day at Annie's suspected hiding places. 3,000 rounds. The gun was not there when they started, and it was not touched when they finished. To find a hidden gun, counter-battery officers watched for its muzzle flash and took a compass bearing on the light. So the German crews laced their powder with a compound that cut the flash to a faint wink, hard to see and gone in an instant. Officers also listened, with microphone arrays that timed the sound of a report to fix where it came from. A gun that fired for 4 minutes and rolled back into solid rock gave those microphones almost nothing to time. And they flew spotter aircraft over the hills to photograph gun pits, so the pilots came home with pictures of decoys. Every standard way of finding a gun assumed it would stand still and show itself. Annie did neither. The reason was a railway tunnel on the Ciampino line, and it is the whole battle in one piece of engineering. The German crews kept both guns inside the tunnel. When they had a target passed to them by forward observers, the locomotive hauled a gun out into the open. The crew fired a short burst, and the gun rolled straight back into the mountain before the Allied reply could arrive. The Germans got very good at the timing. Their normal firing cycle ran about 7 minutes a round. Under fire at Anzio, they compressed it to 4, and learned to send 6 to 8 shells downrange and disappear inside half an hour. Then the tunnel closed over them, and a mountain of solid rock stood between the guns and every shell and bomb the Allies could send. They did not stop at hiding. Out in the open, where a reconnaissance pilot was sure to see them, the Germans built dummy guns with telephone poles for barrels, rigged with fake muzzle flashes and drifting smoke. The decoys pulled bombs and counter-battery fire onto bare ground, while the real guns stayed dark inside the rock. Against deception that good, the 4-mile range gap was almost beside the point. When the Allies did finally locate the tunnel and send fighter bombers against it with heavy bombs, the rock did its job. The attacks scarred the hillside and did little to the guns. By the time the aircraft came for the tunnel in late May, the two guns had already fired their last 16 rounds and pulled out after dark. Behind the guns were a handful of named men doing the concrete work. The railway guns answered to Colonel Frederick Filzinger, who ran the whole railway gun effort. On the ground, a Captain Borchards commanded the two batteries, and on his best day he sent 72 rounds onto the beachhead, the heaviest single day either gun ever fired. One of his bombardiers was a man named Sauerbier. On the 8th of March, the guns found a fuel depot on the beach and set it burning, and the flames from that hit stood 1,000 feet in the air, visible for miles. That is what one gun did to a beach that could not shoot back. There was one break on Annie the Long Toms could take no credit. The 28-centimeter shells she fired were in short supply across the German front, and Allied aircraft worked the rail lines behind her day and night, so the ammunition often could not get forward. When the beach had a quiet day, it usually meant the trains had not come. The tunnel was as safe as it had ever been. How many shells fell in all, no one can honestly say. The records do not agree, and they do not agree by a wide margin. Some accounts credit the two guns with only several hundred rounds across the campaign. Others put the total above 5,000. The truth is buried in unit diaries that never squared with each other, and anyone who gives you a single confident figure is guessing. What is certain is the shape of it. From early February into late May, two guns the Allies could not reach, fired on that beach almost as they pleased. Fire never silenced Anzio Annie. Something else took her. The whole front moved. Through the spring, the Allied armies ground north out of the beachhead and up from the south, and in the last week of May, the line the Germans held around Rome began to come apart. On the 4th of June, Rome fell. The gun that had ruled the beach for 4 months was now a 200-ton machine that could only travel on rails. And Allied aircraft had spent months cutting those rails to pieces. Annie could not run cross-country. She could only follow the track, and the track led back through a shrinking pocket toward the coast. Both guns were pulled back to a rail yard at Civitavecchia, up the coast from Rome, waiting to be moved out. They never made it. The crews were ordered to destroy the guns rather than lose them, and here the two stories split. Robert's crew wrecked their gun thoroughly. On the other gun, the bombardier Sauerbier managed only to blow the breech block and the elevation gear before the position was overrun, and then he escaped on foot toward Rome. That half-finished job is why one of these guns still exists. Leopold was captured close to intact on the 7th of June, sitting on a siding. Soldiers walked up to the gun that had terrorized their beach for 4 months and found it abandoned. They shipped Leopold across the Atlantic. It went to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. American engineers took the gun apart to learn how it worked, and it still sits in the United States today. The most feared weapon on the Anzio front ended its war as a specimen, hauled home by the men it had spent 4 months bombarding. That is the part worth holding on to. The Long Toms never touched Anzio Annie. 4 months of the best counter-battery gunnery the Allies could bring did not silence it. One battery fired 3,000 shells at it in a single day and hit nothing. Heavy bombs on the tunnel only scarred the rock. It was never outfought. For 4 months, the range gap kept it out of reach, and the mountain kept it hidden. What finally beat it was a stretch of broken track it could not cross. The gun was outrun by its own retreating army and left on a siding for the enemy to collect. A gun that moves only on rails is never stronger than the rails behind it. When those ran out, so did Anzio Annie.